When my husband and I returned from vacation, we found that the locks on our house were changed. My son came out on the porch and said, "Surprise! I transferred your house into my name. Now it's mine." But I opened my bag and showed him. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Marjorie Ellen Calloway, and I spent 31 years in that house on Birchwood Lane. 31 years of Sunday dinners, of painting the porch railing every spring, of knowing exactly which floorboard creaked near the kitchen door and exactly how many seconds the downstairs shower took to run warm. That house was not just a property. It was the place where my late husband Harold held my hand through 2 miscarriages before Kevin was finally born healthy. It was where I planted the oak sapling that now shades the entire front yard. It was mine, paid off fully in 2009, the month before Harold passed. After Harold died, I kept going. That is what women of my generation do. I kept the garden, kept the book club on Thursdays, kept the friendship with my neighbor Ruth, who had lived next door since 1987. Kevin came by on holidays. He called on birthdays. I told myself that was normal. Grown children have their own lives. His wife Tiffany was polite in the way that people are polite when they are waiting for you to become useful or to disappear. I noticed it, but I filed it away, the way you file away a sound in the night that you decide must have been the wind. The first real signal came about 8 months before everything fell apart. Kevin called me, not on a Sunday, which was unusual, and asked very casually whether I had ever considered simplifying my estate planning. I told him I had a will. He said a will could take time to process through probate. He used the word probate carefully, like he'd rehearsed it. He suggested I speak to a lawyer he knew, a man named Dennis Farrell, who could help me set things up more efficiently. I said I'd think about it. I didn't call Dennis Farrell. Then in March, Kevin asked if he could borrow some documents, the deed, some old insurance paperwork, just to organize copies for his files. I said yes. I even handed him a folder. I want you to understand how natural he made it seem. He was my son. I had nursed him through chickenpox and a broken arm and a very bad junior year of high school. I handed him the folder without blinking. Looking back, I can see exactly when the pieces were being moved on the board. But when you love someone, you don't watch for chess moves. You watch for smiles. My husband and I keep saying that from habit. Harold had been gone 6 years, but I still traveled with his memory like luggage. Had been planning a trip to Portugal and Spain for over a year. I had a friend from my college years, Patricia, who had retired to Lisbon, and she had been asking me to visit for ages. When Ruth from next door offered to watch the house and water my plants, it felt like everything was falling into place. Kevin called the night before I left. He said, "Have a great trip, Mom. Don't worry about anything here." He sounded warm. He sounded like my son. 3 weeks later, my taxi pulled up to Birchwood Lane, and I noticed, before I even paid the driver, that the front door had a new handle, brushed nickel instead of the old brass. A small thing, but it caught my eye the way wrong things catch your eye when some part of your brain has already registered the danger. I walked up the porch steps with my rolling suitcase behind me, and I put my key in the lock. The key did not turn. I tried again. I stood there on my own porch in the September afternoon light, and my key did not turn in the lock of my own front door. Then the door opened from the inside. Kevin stood there, and behind him, I could see Tiffany in my kitchen, moving around like she already knew where everything was kept. Kevin looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between triumph and embarrassment, the look of a man who has done a thing and is not entirely sure he can sustain the nerve to see it through. "Surprise," he said. "Mom, we need to talk. I've had the house transferred into my name. It made sense, estate-wise. You'll see, it protects everyone. You can still live here, of course. We'll work out the details." He said it like he was doing me a favor. He stood in my doorway, the doorway I had walked through 10,000 times, and he smiled at me like he expected gratitude. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I reached down and opened my handbag. What was in my handbag at that moment was, frankly, nothing dramatic. My passport, my travel wallet, a paperback I had not finished on the plane, a receipt from a cafe in Lisbon where Patricia and I had split a bottle of wine and laughed until we cried. I reached in and I took out my phone, and I looked at Kevin with an expression I hoped was calmer than I felt, and I said, "I need to make a call. Give me a few minutes." He blinked. He had expected tears, I think, or arguments, or confusion. He had not expected calm. "Mom?" "A few minutes, Kevin." I walked back down the porch steps and stood in my driveway, and I called Ruth. She answered on the second ring. "Marjorie, are you back?" "How was—" "Ruth," I said, "I need you to come outside." She came out in her garden clogs and took one look at my face and said nothing foolish. She just took my arm and walked me to her kitchen and put the kettle on. That is the thing about a friendship of 35 years. No explanation required. Sitting at Ruth's table, drinking tea I could barely taste, I allowed myself to feel, for exactly 10 minutes, the full weight of what had happened. I want to be honest with you. It was crushing. Not just the betrayal of the act itself, though that was enormous, but the specific cruelty of its timing. Harold's house. The house I had kept alone for 6 years. The house that was the last physical evidence of our life together. My son had taken it while I was on an airplane somewhere over the Atlantic, and he had stood in the doorway and called it a surprise. I cried in Ruth's kitchen. I want you to know that, because what happened afterward was not the story of a woman who was never afraid. It was the story of a woman who was terrified and decided to move anyway. After 10 minutes, I stopped crying, and I asked Ruth if I could use her computer. The first thing I did was search the county property records online. It took me about 4 minutes to find it. There it was, 14 Birchwood Lane. Owner of record, updated 6 weeks ago. Kevin Harold Calloway. 6 weeks ago. While I was still home, still sleeping in my own bed, still watering my own garden. He had started this before I even left for Portugal. That landed differently than anything else. He hadn't acted in a moment of desperation or opportunity. He had planned it. I sat back in Ruth's chair, and I thought about Dennis Farrell, the lawyer Kevin had recommended 8 months ago. I thought about the folder of documents I had handed Kevin in March, and I thought about a conversation Harold and I had had years ago with our estate attorney, a woman named Carol Nguyen, who had done our wills and who had, at that time, explained to me very carefully the difference between a notarized transfer of deed and a forged one, and what each required. I hadn't fully understood it then. I understood it now. I had one significant advantage that Kevin did not know about. When he'd asked for the deed in March, I had handed him the folder, but the week before, entirely by chance, because I was reorganizing my filing cabinet, I had made a full set of photocopies of every document in that folder, including the deed, and I had brought those copies to my own attorney, a man named Gerald Pace, simply to have them reviewed in connection with updating my will. Gerald still had those copies on file. More importantly, Gerald knew what the original deed looked like, and he would know immediately whether any transfer had been executed with my genuine consent. I called Gerald's office from Ruth's kitchen. It was late afternoon. I got his voicemail. I left a message that was deliberately brief. "Gerald, this is Marjorie Calloway. I believe there may have been a fraudulent transfer of my property at Birchwood Lane. Please call me on my cell as soon as possible. This is urgent." Then I sat for a moment and I thought, what does Kevin think I will do? He thinks I will cry. He thinks I will argue and then accept. He has watched me be a widow for 6 years, and he has mistaken grief for weakness. And that is the most significant miscalculation he has ever made in his life. My first plan was simple. I would not confront Kevin again until I had spoken to Gerald. I would not show my hand. I would not let Kevin know that I was moving. I would stay at Ruth's, telling him I needed a few days to process things emotionally, which was believable, which was even partly true. And in that time, I would understand exactly what he had done and exactly what it would take to undo it. I texted Kevin that evening. I need a few days. I'm staying with Ruth. I'll be in touch. He replied within 2 minutes. Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. We can talk when you're ready. This is going to be good for all of us. I read that message twice. Good for all of us. I set down the phone and looked at Ruth across her kitchen table. He thinks he's already won, I said. Ruth wrapped both her hands around her mug. Then let him think it a little longer. Gerald Pace called me back at 8:15 the following morning. While I was sitting in Ruth's guest room with a cup of coffee I had made quietly so as not to wake her. He had heard my voicemail the previous evening, but had waited until a reasonable hour. That was Gerald. Methodical, unhurried. The kind of attorney who never moved faster than the situation required and never slower. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Marjorie, I want you to come into the office today. Bring your passport, your phone, anything that documents when you were out of the country, and don't go back to the house yet. I was in his office on Clement Street by 10 o'clock. Gerald had already pulled up the county recorder's online database on his screen when I arrived, and he turned the monitor toward me so I could see what he'd found. The deed transfer had been recorded 43 days ago. It listed my name as grantor, meaning I had supposedly signed the house over willingly. Gerald pointed to the notary stamp. Do you recognize that notary? He asked. I leaned forward. The name on the stamp was Dennis Farrell. I looked at Gerald. That's the lawyer Kevin tried to refer me to 8 months ago. Gerald nodded slowly. Yes, I was afraid of something like that. He paused. Marjorie, I need to be direct with you. If someone signed your name on that deed, or if you signed something and were told it was a different document, that is deed fraud. It is a felony in this state. This is not a family dispute. This is a crime. He said it plainly, and I was grateful for that. There is a particular mercy in plainness. He pulled out the copies I had left with him in the spring, the originals I had given him for the will review. We compared the signatures, mine on the old documents and mine on the new deed. Even I could see the difference. The letters were close, but the pressure, the angle of the lowercase l in Callaway, it was slightly wrong. Not dramatically wrong, carefully wrong in the way that someone practices. Can you prove this in court? I asked. A forensic document examiner can, Gerald said. And we have something else in our favor. You were out of the country when this was filed. Your passport stamps will show you were in Lisbon. An international travel record creates what's called an alibi of presence. It makes it essentially impossible to argue you were in this county signing documents. For the first time since I had stood on my porch with a key that didn't fit, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not relief. It was too early for relief. Something more like ground beneath my feet. Gerald filed an emergency title dispute that afternoon with the county recorder's office, which placed a legal cloud on the property, meaning Kevin could not sell it, refinance it, or take any further action with the title until the dispute was resolved. It did not give me back the house yet, but it stopped the bleeding. What I did not know, until Ruth told me that evening, was that Kevin had already driven slowly past her house twice that afternoon. Ruth had seen him from her front window, his gray SUV rolling past, slowing, not stopping. He was checking on me. He was watching. I thought about what that meant. He didn't know what I was doing, but he sensed movement. He had expected me to be crying in Ruth's guest room, and something, some instinct, was telling him I wasn't just crying. Tiffany called my cell at 6 that evening. She was warm, almost theatrical in her warmth. She called me Mom. She had not called me that in 2 years. "We've been worried about you," she said. "Kevin feels terrible that this was such a shock. We should have handled the conversation differently. We'd love for you to come over for dinner. To your house, I mean, and just talk through everything." Your house, I mean. A small slip, or perhaps deliberate. A reminder of who held the keys. "Thank you, Tiffany," I said. "I'm not ready for that yet. I'm still processing." "Of course," she said, in the tone of someone who is beginning to be impatient. "Just don't wait too long. We want this to be a positive thing for the whole family." After I hung up, I wrote down the exact words she had used. Not because I thought the phone call was evidence of anything, it wasn't, but because I had begun to understand that in a situation like this, everything needed to be recorded. Every conversation, every visit, every text. I had crossed a line that afternoon in Gerald's office that I could not uncross. Kevin and Tiffany had committed a crime, and I was going to prove it. There was no version of this that ended with forgiveness and Sunday dinners. I understood that now, and I accepted it, which was perhaps the hardest single moment in this entire story. The grief of it was real, but so was my resolve. The next morning, I asked Ruth to drive me to the county assessor's office in person because some things are better done face to face. I brought my passport, my travel itinerary, the printout of the recorded deed that Gerald had prepared, and a letter from Gerald on his firm's letterhead formally notifying the county of the disputed transfer. The clerk, a young woman with reading glasses on a chain, looked at my documents and then looked at me over the top of her glasses, and something in her expression changed. "Ma'am," she said more quietly, "did someone forge your signature on this deed?" "That's what we believe," I said. She took an extra copy of everything I had brought, stamped my set as received, and gave me a case number. She also gave me, unprompted, a card for the county district attorney's consumer fraud division. "You might want to call them," she said, sliding it across the counter, "just in case." That afternoon, Gerald submitted a formal complaint to the State Bar Association regarding Dennis Farrell, the notary attorney whose stamp appeared on the fraudulent document. This was a separate track from the title dispute, slower but significant. A notary who stamps a fraudulent document is in serious professional and legal jeopardy. Dennis Farrell was, Gerald had learned through a quick check of public records, not Kevin's casual acquaintance. He was Tiffany's second cousin. That detail crystallized something for me. This had not been Kevin acting alone out of some impulsive desperation. Tiffany had brought the instrument. Tiffany had arranged the mechanism. Kevin had walked up to my door and delivered the speech, but Tiffany had engineered the architecture. I was back at Ruth's that evening when Kevin called. Not a text this time. A call, which told me something. He was no longer comfortable with the distance that text messages create. "I heard you went to the county offices today," he said. I kept my voice even. "Where did you hear that? It doesn't matter." A pause. "Mom, I need you to understand something. What I did was legal. I had every right to protect family assets. If you keep pushing this, you're going to create a legal situation that hurts everyone, including you. It's going to cost money. It's going to take time. It's going to become a public record. Is that really what you want?" He was trying to present it as a warning delivered in my interest, but what I heard underneath it was the first tremor of fear. "I appreciate your concern," I said. "I'll be in touch." He didn't like that. "Mom, good night, Kevin." 3 days later, Kevin and Tiffany showed up at Ruth's front door. I was in the kitchen. Ruth answered, and I heard Tiffany's voice before I heard Kevin's. High, controlled, with that particular quality of someone performing patience. Ruth, to her eternal credit, did not let them in. She stood in the doorway and said, "Marjorie isn't available right now." Kevin said he just needed 5 minutes. Tiffany said they had brought food. She used the word reconciliation, which was, I thought, a very particular choice. Ruth said she would pass along the message, but they didn't leave. They stood on Ruth's porch for nearly 10 minutes, and through the kitchen window, I watched Kevin pace twice the length of the porch. Then Tiffany said something to him I couldn't hear, and he stopped pacing and said, loudly enough that I could hear through the glass, "She has no idea what she's doing. Gerald Pace is a small-time attorney, and this is going to go nowhere." Ruth closed the door. She came into the kitchen and sat across from me. "He's scared," she said. "I know," I said. "Scared people are dangerous." The following day, Gerald called with an update. The title cloud was holding. The county had flagged the transaction for investigation, and Gerald had reached out, quietly, to a forensic document examiner, a retired FBI specialist named Margaret Okonkwo, who had agreed to review the signature comparison. Her preliminary opinion, based on the copies. The signature on the deed was not mine. That was not a legal finding yet. But it was, as Gerald put it, significant momentum. After I hung up, I sat for a long time in Ruth's guest room, looking out at the backyard where her bird feeder needed refilling, and I let myself feel, briefly, the exhaustion. Not defeat. I was nowhere near defeat. But the particular tiredness of sustained alertness, of watching every word and every door and every car that slows in front of a friend's house. I gave myself the weekend. I called Patricia in Lisbon and told her, briefly, without drama, what had happened. She listened and then said, "Marjorie, you are the most competent person I have ever known. Handle your business and then come visit again next spring." It made me laugh, which was what I needed. I slept. I read the rest of my paperback. I let Ruth feed me her excellent chicken soup. On Monday morning, I got up, made my bed, and went back to work. Monday arrived with cool fog and the smell of Ruth's coffee, and I moved through the morning with the particular clarity that rest gives you when you have allowed yourself to actually rest. I returned calls to Gerald. I wrote a precise, factual account of every event since my return. Dates, times, exact words. Because Gerald had asked me to, and also because the act of writing it helped me see the shape of things more clearly. It is harder to panic about a situation you have documented. Kevin sent me a text at 11 that morning. It was careful and polished in a way that suggested Tiffany had edited it. "Mom, we've been thinking, and we want to do right by you. We'd like to set up a monthly payment, your choice of amount, so you have financial security and peace of mind, and you can continue living in the house for as long as you want. We love you and just want this resolved." I read it twice, and I will be honest with you. For a brief moment, something in me wanted to be tired enough to accept it. Not because I believed them, but because resolution, even a false one, promises an end to vigilance, and vigilance is exhausting. But I thought about what that offer actually was. It was Kevin proposing to pay me a stipend to live in my own house, which he had stolen. It was Tiffany offering me the comfort of a situation they had engineered. It was, in short, a cage decorated with a monthly deposit. I replied, "Thank you for reaching out. I am working with my attorney and cannot discuss terms outside that process." Gerald had advised this exact language. It was factual, it was lawful, and it communicated without saying so that I was no longer operating alone. There was no reply for 2 hours. Then, "We didn't know you'd gotten an attorney involved. We just wanted to keep this in the family." I forwarded that text to Gerald. What happened next surprised me, and I think it is important to tell you about it because it was the part of this experience that I did not expect and it turned out to matter enormously. Ruth had, without telling me, mentioned what was happening to two other women in our Thursday book club, Joan, a retired school teacher, and Beverly, who had worked in the county clerk's office for 22 years before retiring. She had not gossiped. She had been worried about me and had reached out to people she trusted. Beverly called me that Monday afternoon. She had, she said, seen situations like mine before. Not often, but before. She knew the specific language of how county records offices handled fraud investigations. She knew the names of two people in the district attorney's office who took property crimes against elderly residents seriously. She offered to make introductions on my behalf. I sat in Ruth's armchair and listened to Beverly speak with the calm efficiency of someone who knows exactly which doors to knock on and in what order. And I felt something I had not felt since I had stood on my porch with a key that wouldn't turn. I felt that I was not alone. Joan came by that evening with a casserole and a copy of a newspaper article about a similar case in a neighboring county. A grown child who had used a questionable power of attorney to transfer a parent's property. That case had been reversed in court. The child had been charged. Joan had underlined the relevant paragraphs in pencil with the same quiet intention with which she had, no doubt, annotated books for 40 years of teaching. I looked it up because I wanted you to see it was possible, she said, not to upset you. That is community. That is what it looks like when it functions correctly. With Beverly's introductions, Gerald was able to get a meeting with an assistant district attorney named Rashida Coleman within the week. He briefed me afterward. Coleman had reviewed Gerald's preliminary findings and confirmed that the evidence, if it held, was consistent with deed fraud under state law. She was not making promises. She never would at that stage. But she had opened a file. Meanwhile, Kevin and Tiffany had gone quiet. No calls, no texts, no slow drives past Ruth's house. This silence felt deliberate, strategic, the quiet of people who are recalculating. I was not fooled by it. I had grown up in a house with a father who went quiet before he dug in, and I recognized the pattern. They were not retreating. They were watching to see what I would do next, waiting for a moment of uncertainty they could enter. I gave them nothing to enter. I kept my phone conversations short and documented. I continued staying with Ruth. I did not drive past my own house, though I wanted to. Not out of sentimentality, but because I wanted to see the oak tree, Harold's oak tree, and know it was still there. But I did not go. There was a time for that, and it was not yet. They came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the text exchange, and this time they did not come to Ruth's door. They came to Gerald's office. I was not there when they arrived. I was at the county recorder's office with Beverly, who was helping me navigate a supplemental records request. But Gerald's assistant called me and told me Kevin and Tiffany were in the waiting room without an appointment, asking to speak with Gerald. Gerald had his assistant inform them that he could not discuss an active legal matter with opposing parties without their counsel present, and that they were welcome to have their attorney contact his office. Tiffany had apparently replied that they didn't have an attorney, that this was a family matter, and that surely Gerald could just let them explain. Gerald did not let them explain. They waited 20 minutes and left. That evening, Kevin called me. I answered, because by then I had established a clear record of all our communications, and I wanted this one documented too. "Mom, I want to come see you." His voice was different from the last time. Softer, with something underneath it that I recognized, because I had heard it when he was a boy who had done something wrong and was hoping charm could repair it. Not at Ruth's. Somewhere neutral. Coffee, just the two of us. No Tiffany. No Tiffany was, I realized, intended to be a concession, a sign of good faith. I thought for a moment. Gerald had advised me not to meet with Kevin without counsel, but Gerald had also said that any communication Kevin initiated was useful as long as I controlled the setting and kept records. A public coffee shop, with my phone recording, seemed manageable. We met Saturday morning at a cafe on Morrison Street that neither of us had particular associations with. Neutral ground, as he'd said, in a room full of people ordering lattes and working on laptops. Kevin arrived looking tired. That surprised me. I had been sleeping better than I had in weeks. He, apparently, had not. He started carefully. He said he loved me. He said he had made a mistake in the way he had handled things. He said he was sorry for the shock of the homecoming. Then he moved, almost without transition, into what I recognized as the real agenda. You have to understand that Tiffany and I are in a difficult position financially, he said. The house. We used the value of the house to secure some financing. There are people involved now who aren't us. If this title dispute goes forward, it's not just Kevin and Tiffany who get hurt. There are financial institutions. There are obligations. I looked at him steadily. You used my house as collateral? He had the grace to look uncomfortable. We needed capital. It was supposed to be a bridge solution. We were going to sort it out before I knew, I said. He stopped. Mom, if you push this, it doesn't just affect us. It affects you, your credit, your name. You'll be entangled in this for years. Gerald Pace is not equipped to fight what's coming. I'm trying to protect you. There it was, the threat dressed as protection, the cage presented as shelter. I thought, sitting in that cafe, about what it must have cost him to come here. Not emotionally, but strategically. He would not have come unless he was genuinely worried. The title cloud was working. The DA's office had opened a file. Something had moved enough that Kevin felt he needed to apply pressure in person. I looked at my son across the table. This man I had raised, this man for whom I had once sat in a hospital waiting room for 11 hours. And I felt grief, and I felt fury. And underneath both of those, I felt something very cold and very clear. Kevin, I said, I'm going to suggest that you hire an attorney, a real one, not Dennis Farrell. His face changed. The softness left it like water draining from a bowl. You don't know what you're doing, he said. Not angry yet. Something more controlled than anger, something I found more alarming. Tiffany and I have resources you don't know about, and we have time. So do I said. I left the cafe first. I walked to my car, sat inside with the doors locked, and let my hands shake for exactly 3 minutes. Because he had frightened me. I want to be honest about that. He had frightened me. Not with any specific threat, but with the look on his face when the charm dropped. The look of someone who has been exposed and is deciding what to do about it. But here is what I understood. Driving back to Ruth's house. The fear was real, and the fear was useful. A woman who feels no fear is a woman who is underestimating the danger. I was not underestimating it. I was counting it accurately, and I was choosing to move forward anyway. I called Gerald from the car and told him about the financing. He was silent for a moment, and then he said very quietly, he used the house as collateral. That's what he told me. Marjorie, Gerald said, that changes things considerably. We need to talk to Rashida Coleman again, today. Gerald had the meeting with Rashida Coleman arranged by Monday morning, and this time I was in the room. Coleman's office was on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. A room that smelled of paper and effort, with case files stacked in precise columns along one wall. She was younger than I had expected, maybe 40, with the particular alertness of someone who does not waste attention on things that don't matter and misses nothing that does. Gerald had prepared a complete dossier. I watched Coleman read through it. The original deed copies Gerald had on file, the new fraudulent transfer, the signature comparison from Margaret Okonkwo, my passport stamps, the documented timeline, the records of Kevin's calls and texts, and now, the most recent and most significant addition, Gerald's research into the loan Kevin had mentioned at the cafe. That research had taken Gerald's paralegal less than 48 hours. Kevin and Tiffany had taken out a home equity loan against my house, a property that, at the time, had been fraudulently transferred into Kevin's name, for $230,000. The lender was a private financial firm, not a bank, which explained why the underwriting had not flagged the ownership irregularity. The loan had been issued 3 weeks after the deed transfer. Coleman read this and looked up at me. "Mrs. Calloway, I want to ask you something directly. Did you at any point give your son authorization to take out a loan against your property?" "No," I said, "I did not." "Were you aware of this loan in any form?" "No, I was in Portugal." She made a note. "This is no longer just deed fraud," she said. "Using fraudulently obtained property as collateral for a loan is bank fraud. Federal jurisdiction applies when a financial institution is involved in the deception, even a private one, if they operate across state lines." She paused. "I need to make some calls." What happened next took 3 weeks to arrange, but Gerald kept me informed at every step. Coleman coordinated with the DA's office and, because of the financial institution element, a federal financial crimes investigator became involved. Kevin and Tiffany were formally served with notice of the criminal investigation. Dennis Farrell, upon being contacted by the state bar and the DA simultaneously, retained his own attorney within 24 hours, which told everyone what they needed to know about what Dennis Farrell intended to do when things became difficult. He cooperated. Gerald called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "Dennis Farrell gave a full statement. He has confirmed that he was paid by Kevin to notarize a document with your signature, which had been forged. He has provided documentation of the payment and communications regarding the arrangement." I sat down slowly. "Kevin paid him?" "Yes." "And Tiffany arranged the connection?" Farrell's statement includes email communications with Tiffany organizing the transaction. The confrontation happened on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room at the county courthouse. I had not requested it. Coleman had arranged it as part of the investigation process, a formal recorded interview with Kevin and Tiffany, in which they were given the opportunity to provide their account. Gerald attended with me as a private witness to proceedings. I was not technically a party to the criminal interview. But Coleman had allowed me to be present because, as she said, the victim has a right to witness the process. Kevin and Tiffany arrived with an attorney they had evidently hired very recently, a man I didn't recognize who kept whispering to Kevin as Coleman laid out what the investigation had found. I sat across the table and I watched my son's face as the evidence was presented, piece by piece. He tried first to maintain that the transfer had been legitimate, that I had signed documents before the trip and had perhaps forgotten. His attorney whispered something, and Kevin stopped talking. Tiffany tried a different approach. She said the whole matter was a misunderstanding, that the family had simply been trying to plan ahead, that there was no intent to deceive. Coleman placed the emails between Tiffany and Dennis Farrell on the table. The emails discussing the fee for notarization and the need for the signature to look as close as possible. Tiffany looked at those emails for a long time. A very long time. Long enough that the silence in the room became its own kind of verdict. "Those could be misinterpreted," Kevin said finally. Coleman looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard this sentence many times and has long since stopped finding it interesting. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "the document examiner's finding is that the signature on the deed transfer is not your mother's. Your cousin by marriage has confirmed in a sworn statement that he was paid to notarize a document he knew to be fraudulent. You obtained a $230,000 loan against a property you did not legally own. How would you prefer those facts to be interpreted? Kevin had no answer. He looked at Tiffany, and I watched him do it. That small, involuntary turn of the head toward the person he had done all of this with, looking for something she could not give him now. Tiffany was staring at the table. She did not look back. Their attorney put his hand on Kevin's arm. Don't answer. What struck me in that moment was how small they had both become. Not physically, but in the way that people shrink when the version of themselves they have been performing collapses, and there is nothing underneath it substantial enough to stand on. Kevin had walked into that room as a man with a plan, with a story, with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent months believing he was smarter than everyone around him. Now he sat in a county courthouse chair and looked at the table and had nothing to say. I had spent 31 years in that house. I had raised this man in that house. And I understood, sitting in that room, that the greatest miscalculation he had ever made was not legal or financial. It was personal. He had looked at me, his mother, a widow, a woman in her late 60s who cried in her friend's kitchen, and he had seen someone who could be outmaneuvered. He had not seen someone who had buried a husband and kept a house and built a life with her own 2 hands and knew, at the cellular level, what was worth fighting for. I did not feel triumph in that moment. What I felt was something harder to name. A clarity that comes when a thing you were afraid to look at directly is finally just sitting in the light. I looked at Kevin once, directly, before I left the room. He looked away first. The legal process did not move the way drama does. It moved the way bureaucracy does, which is to say deliberately, with paperwork and waiting periods and precise procedural language. But it moved decisively, and it moved in one direction. Within 10 days of the recorded interview, Kevin's attorney contacted Gerald with an offer. Kevin would sign a quitclaim deed restoring full ownership of 14 Birchwood Lane to me, in exchange for me agreeing not to pursue additional civil litigation. Gerald brought me the offer. I looked at it for a moment, and then I asked Gerald what he thought my position was. Excellent, he said. Coleman's investigation is proceeding regardless of any civil agreement. You don't need to trade anything for the house. The title will be restored through the criminal restitution process. Then no, I said. Gerald delivered that to Kevin's attorney, and I understand there was a long pause on the phone before the man said he would consult with his client. I imagine that pause contained a great deal of recalibration. Kevin and Tiffany were formally charged 8 weeks after the courthouse meeting. Kevin faced charges of deed fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud. Tiffany faced identical charges, plus an additional count related to her direct role in coordinating the forgery. Dennis Farrell, in exchange for his cooperation, was charged with a reduced single count of notarial misconduct, a charge that would nonetheless result in permanent revocation of his professional license and, under the terms of his plea, a substantial fine. The loan against my house, $230,000, was a more complicated thread. Because the lender, a private firm called Meridian Capital, had failed to conduct adequate title verification, they bore partial responsibility for the fraudulent transaction. Their attorneys and Gerald's spent 6 weeks negotiating the terms under which the loan would be voided, and Meridian would pursue Kevin directly for recovery of the funds. My property was released from that lien entirely. The debt became Kevin's problem, as it should always have been. The deed was formally restored to my name on a Tuesday morning in November. Gerald called me while I was at Ruth's kitchen table and said, "Marjorie, you are the legal and sole owner of 14 Birchwood Lane as of 9:47 this morning." I said thank you. Then I sat very quietly for a moment, holding the phone against my chest. Not because I was composing myself, but because I needed to feel the weight of the sentence before I set it down. 9:47 on a Tuesday morning. That was when it became, again, irrevocably mine. Ruth drove me to the house. I had not been there in nearly 3 months. It was November, so the garden was quiet, the roses cut back, the beds mulched for winter, because Ruth had arranged for a neighbor's son to tend it while I was away. The oak tree stood in the front yard where it had always stood, broad and unhurried, the way Harold had always been. I stopped on the sidewalk and looked at it for a moment before I went up the steps. The county had arranged for the locks to be changed, back, this time, with keys that were mine. I stood on the porch and I put my key in, and it turned cleanly the first try. Such a small thing. Such a completely unremarkable thing, a key turning in a lock. I had done it 10,000 times and never thought about it once. I thought about it now. I walked through the rooms slowly. Kevin and Tiffany had been living there for nearly 3 months, and the marks of their presence were everywhere. Furniture moved, a new rug in the living room that was not mine, different soap in the bathroom, a coffee maker on the counter that I didn't recognize. These things bothered me less than I expected. They were just objects. Objects can be moved. The house was still the house. The angle of afternoon light through the dining room window was exactly as I had always known it. The particular sound the furnace made when it kicked on in cold weather was the same. The garden outside the back door was patient and waiting and still mine. In the kitchen, the creak in the third drawer from the left was exactly where I had left it. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard, and I thought about Harold. And I thought about 31 years. And I thought about the 9-year-old version of Kevin, who had once stood in this same yard trying to build a birdhouse with his father, and made a mess of it, and been proud of it anyway. I allowed myself to grieve that version of Kevin, briefly, because it deserved to be grieved. Then I put the kettle on. Kevin and Tiffany had been required, as a condition of the criminal proceedings, to vacate the property and account for any damage or items removed. Their attorney sent a list and a payment for assessed damages. I reviewed it, confirmed it was accurate, and signed the acknowledgement. That was the last direct correspondence I had with anyone representing Kevin. Kevin's plea agreement, finalized the following spring, included probation, mandatory community service, full restitution of my legal costs, and a criminal record that would follow him through every professional background check for the rest of his working life. Tiffany's agreement was nearly identical. Kevin lost his position at the finance firm when the conviction became public. These things always do become public, because they are public record, and because people talk. He had built a career in a field that considers fiduciary trust foundational. A fraud conviction is not a speed bump in that field. It is a wall. I did not feel vindicated. I felt that something had been corrected. There is a difference, and it matters. That first winter back in the house, I repainted the porch railing. Not because it needed it. Ruth's neighbor's son had done a fine job. But because I wanted to. I wanted the particular ritual of it. The smell of paint in cold air, the brush in my hand moving in long, steady strokes, the sense of returning a thing to its proper order. It took me an afternoon, and I was sore the next day, and I did not care at all. I also, in January, updated my will with Gerald and converted the deed into a living trust structured with multiple layers of verification. Any future transfer would require my in-person, notarized, witnessed consent, with a mandatory review period built in. Gerald had recommended this years ago. I simply had not gotten around to it. I got around to it now. Better late than right about Kevin, as Ruth said, and we both laughed. And it was the kind of laughter that is only possible on the other side of something hard. In February, I took a short class at the community center. Watercolor painting, which I had always been curious about and never tried. I was not talented. I did not need to be. I sat on Tuesday evenings at a long table with 7 other people ranging in age from 30 to 84, and I made imprecise paintings of flowers and landscapes, and I drank the bad coffee they provided, and I came home pleased. Is that not enough? It seemed like more than enough to me. Ruth and I had dinner together every Thursday. Joan and Beverly came regularly. The book club continued. We had been reading together long enough that we had a shorthand, a generosity of attention with each other that takes years to build and is, in my view, one of the most valuable things a person can accumulate. Beverly, who had been so practically useful during the worst of things, became a closer friend than she had been before. There is a particular bond that forms between people who have been useful to each other in a crisis, something more solid than ordinary affection. We went to a lecture series at the public library together in the spring, 4 Tuesday evenings on American landscape painting, and argued pleasantly about Winslow Homer afterward over dinner. It was very good. In the spring, I called Patricia in Lisbon and told her it was finally over. She said she had never doubted me for a single day. I cried a little, which she politely pretended not to notice, and then she told me about a small apartment near her building available for rent in August and asked whether I might want to come back. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for approximately 4 days, and then I booked the flights. I went in August. 3 weeks, Lisbon, a long weekend in the Algarve, a day trip to a small hilltop town whose name I cannot now spell, but whose bread I still think about. I swam in the Atlantic for the first time in years. I ate sardines on a terrace in the evening light with Patricia, who has aged the way that interesting people age, with more character and more humor, and not enough patience for pretense. We talked about Harold. We talked about her late husband, Ernesto. We talked about what it means to have a life that is genuinely yours, and whether that is something you choose or something you build or both. I came back to Birchwood Lane in September, walked through my front door, set down my bag, made tea, and stood in the kitchen, listening to the ordinary sounds of the place. The furnace, the refrigerator, the third drawer from the left if you pulled it wrong. This is mine, I thought. This was always mine. And that is settled now. What happened to Kevin and Tiffany in that same period is a matter of public record and straightforward consequence, and I will tell you plainly, because I think plainness is what they deserve. Kevin's conviction became known in his professional community within weeks of sentencing. These things move quickly, and the financial services world is smaller than it appears from the outside. He was dismissed from his firm. He applied elsewhere. I was told by mutual acquaintances who felt I had a right to know and were probably correct. He did not find comparable work. A fraud conviction in a field built on trust is not something that can be managed or reframed. It simply sits there in every background check, on every professional record, waiting to be found. The civil judgment Meridian Capital obtained against him for the $230,000 was documented in public court records as well. That kind of debt at interest does not shrink. Tiffany's professional life suffered comparably. She had worked in real estate, a field with its own licensing requirements and ethics standards, both of which her conviction implicated. Her license was reviewed and ultimately suspended, pending the outcome of a professional conduct proceeding. Whether she recovered it, I don't know. I did not look further than that. Dennis Farrell, whose cooperation had been so instrumental to the outcome, did not escape consequence simply because he had cooperated. His license was revoked permanently. He paid his fine. What he did afterward with a life stripped of its professional identity was not something I followed. I heard through those same mutual acquaintances the following year that Kevin and Tiffany had separated. I did not seek the details. I did not need them. a marriage constructed partly on shared criminal conspiracy and partly on the sustained belief that an elderly widow could be outmaneuvered indefinitely, is not a marriage built on anything that holds. I was not surprised. I was not satisfied, exactly. I did not feel their unhappiness as a reward. I felt it as consequence, which is a different and more accurate thing. What I felt as reward was simpler and more durable. My own life returned to me whole. I planted bulbs that October, tulips and daffodils both, pushed into the cold front garden soil one by one in the late afternoon, while the light went amber and the oak tree threw its long shadow across the yard. Harold had liked daffodils. I had always planted them for him. I planted them again for both of us, and for myself, and for the simple, stubborn fact of continuity, that a thing buried in cold ground in autumn comes back in March without being asked, without needing to be convinced, because that is simply what it does. The daffodils came up in March, yellow and ordinary and entirely mine. I stood at the living room window and looked at them, and I thought, this is what staying looks like. Not the dramatic staying of a crisis, but the quiet staying of a morning in your own house, with your key on the hook by the door and your name on the deed, and nowhere in particular you have to be. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. I have told you this story because I want you to understand something. Age does not make you a target unless you allow fear to make you passive. The moment I chose to act, not to fight, but simply to move, everything changed. If your name is on a document, protect it. Know your rights. Build relationships with people who will stand beside you. And if someone tries to take what is yours while calling it a favor, open your handbag and start documenting. What would you have done in my place? I'd love to know. Thank you for listening. My son's wife said, "Choose, either me or your mother." He chose her. I left silently and canceled all my payments for his mortgage. The next morning, he was standing at my doorstep. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I was 63 years old when I learned that love, without boundaries, is not love at all. It is an open door that the wrong people will walk right through. I had lived in my house on Maple Creek Drive for 31 years. The same house where I raised Kevin after his father left when Kevin was 7. The same house where I painted the kitchen 3 times because I could never quite decide between cream and ivory. The same house where I cried alone on the night Kevin left for college, and then cooked a large pot of chicken soup I didn't need just to have something to do with my hands. Kevin was my only child. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you the rest. When you have only one, every milestone becomes enormous. His first steps, his first broken bone, his first heartbreak. I carried all of it with him. And when he came to me at 31 years old and said he'd found the woman he wanted to marry, I cried happy tears right there in my kitchen. Her name was Brittany. She was 30 years old, quick with a smile and quicker with an opinion. She had sharp green eyes and a habit of tilting her head when she spoke to you, as if she were genuinely listening. I thought at first that it was warmth. Later, I understood it was calculation. I liked her in the beginning. I want to be honest about that. I brought her flowers the first time Kevin introduced us at a restaurant in town. I invited her to Thanksgiving, 3 weeks after they started dating. I gave her my mother's cornbread recipe, which I had never written down for anyone. I tried. I genuinely tried. But Brittany had a way of making rooms smaller. When she entered my kitchen, it was no longer quite my kitchen. When she sat in the living room, the furniture seemed to rearrange itself around her preferences. Small things, the kind of things you cannot complain about without sounding unreasonable. Dorothy, do you really need to call Kevin every Sunday? We're trying to establish our own routines. Dorothy, I hope you don't mind. I rearranged the guest room when we visited. The feng shui was completely off. Dorothy, Kevin mentioned you gave him money again. We'd appreciate if you'd run things like that by me first. I ran things by her. I adjusted. I apologized when I couldn't even name what I had done wrong. I told myself this was what modern mothers-in-law did. You stepped back. You made space. You were grateful for whatever portion of your son's life you were permitted to occupy. Then came the house. Kevin and Brittany wanted to buy a home in Clarksville, a 3-bedroom colonial with a 2-car garage and a backyard large enough for the children Brittany said they would have someday. The price was $387,000. They had a down payment. They had Kevin's income from his project management job. What they did not have was enough to satisfy the bank's comfort with their debt-to-income ratio. Kevin came to me on a Tuesday evening. He sat in the same chair his father used to sit in, and he asked me quietly if I would co-sign the mortgage and contribute $1,100 a month toward the payment. He said it would be temporary, 2, maybe 3 years, until they were more established. I said yes. Of course I said yes. What was I going to do? Watch my son lose the house he wanted? I had the savings. My own house was paid off. I could afford it. And if I am being truthful, I believed that helping them build a life together would build something between Brittany and me as well. Shared investment. Common ground. For 14 months, I paid faithfully. Every first of the month, $1,100 transferred directly to the mortgage account. I attended their housewarming party and brought a gift. I babysat their rescue dog when they took a vacation to Charleston. I painted their nursery when Brittany announced she was pregnant, then quietly repainted it when she changed the color scheme without telling me. And then, on a Saturday afternoon in October, Brittany called me into the living room of the house I was helping to pay for, sat down across from me with her hands folded in her lap, and said, "Dorothy, I think it's time we had a conversation about boundaries. Kevin and I have talked, and we feel like you're too present in our lives. It's affecting our marriage, family. So I'm going to need you to make a family. So I'm going to need you to make a choice. Either you respect our boundaries completely, meaning you stop dropping by, you stop calling without scheduling first, you stop inserting yourself, or Kevin and I are going to need some serious distance." She paused. "What I'm saying, Dorothy, is that Kevin needs to choose his old family or his new one." The room was very quiet. I looked at my son. He looked at Brittany. And in that long, agonizing silence, I understood that the choice had already been made. He chose her. I picked up my purse. I said nothing. I walked out the front door of the house that my $1,100 a month was helping to keep over their heads. I drove home on autopilot, my hands steady on the wheel while everything inside me came apart. I made myself a cup of tea I did not drink. I sat in the dark of my kitchen on Maple Creek Drive, and then I began to think very clearly. I did not sleep that night. Not really. I lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around me, the small creaks and sighs of a structure that had stood through 30 years of my life. I thought about Kevin as a boy. I thought about the first time he'd scraped his knee and how I'd held him while he cried. I thought about driving him to his first job interview, how nervous he'd been, how I'd told him in the parking lot that he was more capable than he knew. And then I thought about him staring at the floor while his wife gave me an ultimatum in the house I was paying for. By 4 a.m, grief had begun its slow conversion into something more useful. I got up. I put on the kitchen light. I made coffee. I sat at the table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and I began to write down numbers. 14 months of payments at $1,100 per month. That was $15,400 I had contributed to Kevin and Brittany's mortgage. In addition to the cosign, which meant my credit, my financial reputation, my name was legally attached to that property. If they missed a payment, it would appear on my credit report. If they defaulted, I could be held responsible for the balance. I was not a generous grandmother sending birthday checks. I was a financial partner in their home, without a single legal protection in return. I had no agreement in writing, no promissory note, no clause specifying what would happen if our relationship deteriorated. I had handed over $15,400 and my credit standing on the basis of love and the assumption that family meant something. Was I foolish? Yes. I will admit that without shame, because admitting it was the first step toward doing something about it. The second thing I wrote down was simpler. What Brittany had actually said to me. I wrote it from memory, word by word, as accurately as I could reconstruct it. Either you respect our boundaries completely, or Kevin and I are going to need some serious distance. She had framed it as a boundary. But what it was, in practical terms, was a demand that I continue to fund their lives while accepting exclusion from them. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I wrote, "They cannot have both." That was the beginning of the plan, not revenge. I want to be precise about that. I am not a vindictive woman. I believe in consequences, not cruelty. What I understood, sitting in my kitchen at 4 in the morning, was that I had been operating under an imbalance that I alone had the power to correct. Brittany had given me a choice: comply or accept distance. She had not considered that I had a choice of my own. She had not thought through the mechanics of what would happen if I simply stopped. If I withdrew my monthly payments, the mortgage would become $1,100 harder to manage every month. Kevin's income was good, but not so good that the gap would be painless. They had a baby on the way. Brittany had cut back her hours at the marketing firm where she worked. The math was not comfortable for them without me. More significantly, I was a co-signer. That was a legal relationship, not an emotional one. Emotions, Brittany had made clear, were subject to her approval. But the bank did not care about her approval. The bank cared about documentation. I wrote down 3 things I needed to do. First, speak to a financial attorney about my rights and exposure as a co-signer. I needed to understand what I could and could not do without damaging my own financial standing. Second, contact the mortgage servicer directly and explore my options regarding the co-signer status. Third, document everything: the payments I had made, the date of Saturday's conversation, everything Brittany had said, Kevin's silence, all of it. Was I afraid? Deeply. The fear was not of Brittany, though she was formidable in her way. The fear was of losing Kevin permanently, of taking an action that would push him further into her orbit rather than pulling him back toward clarity. Every mother who has watched a child be absorbed into a damaging dynamic knows that fear. You pull too hard, you lose them faster. But I also knew this. I had already lost him on Saturday afternoon. He had sat in a chair and said nothing while his wife handed me an ultimatum. Whatever I was going to lose, I had already begun losing it long before I made any decision. Sky was beginning to lighten at its edges. The sky was beginning to lighten at its edges, gray and uncertain, the way October mornings are in this part of the country. I watched it for a while. Then I picked up the phone and made an appointment with an attorney named Patricia Greer, whose office I had driven past 100 times on my way to the grocery store. The next morning, Sunday, Kevin appeared on my doorstep. He looked like he hadn't slept either. That, at least, was something. He stood on my porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, his shoulders slightly drawn in the way they always were when he was ashamed of something, a posture I recognized from when he was 14 and had dented the car. The morning was cold. I could see his breath. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" I looked at him for a moment. This man who had once been the boy I raised. This man who had sat in silence while his wife issued demands. I stepped back and let him in. We sat in the kitchen. I did not offer coffee, which was, for me, a significant statement. Kevin noticed. He folded his hands on the table and looked at them, then at me. "I'm sorry about yesterday," he said. Brittany was frustrated. She didn't mean it to come out so harshly. "How did she mean it to come out?" I asked. He didn't have a good answer to that. He said they loved me. He said Brittany was under a lot of stress with the pregnancy. He said they just needed some structure. He said structure and boundaries and communication so many times that the words lost their shapes entirely. I listened. I did not argue. I did not cry, which seemed to unsettle him more than crying would have. When he finished, I said, "Kevin, I hear you. I need a few days to process things." He seemed relieved by that. He probably thought process meant I would soften, come around, agree to Brittany's terms. He hugged me at the door, a quick, uncertain embrace, and drove away in the direction of the house I was helping him pay for. I watched his car until it disappeared. Then I went inside and called Patricia Greer's office to confirm my Monday appointment. Patricia Greer was in her late 50s, compact and precise, with silver-framed glasses and the kind of calm that comes from 20 years of watching families in conflict. Her office smelled like coffee and old paper. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You're a co-signer," she said. "That's different from a co-borrower in some respects, but your name is on that mortgage. Your credit is exposed, and your voluntary monthly contributions. You have no written agreement?" "Nothing," I said. "Stop at any time. That's your legal stop at any time. That's your legal right." She paused. "Stopping will create financial pressure on them, but it won't remove you from the co-signer liability automatically. That requires either refinancing the loan without you or a formal release from the lender, which the lender grants only if the primary borrowers qualify on their own." "Do they qualify on their own?" I asked. "Based on what you've described, Brittany reducing her hours, the new baby coming, it's unlikely they'd qualify for a refinance right now without a cosigner." She looked at me steadily. "Which means if they want you off the loan, they'll need to either increase their income significantly or sell the house." I sat with that information. It was not comfortable, but it was clarifying. Patricia helped me draft a formal letter to the mortgage servicer, flagging my co-signer status and requesting documentation of my rights. She also advised me to begin a paper trail. Every payment I had made, every communication with Kevin and Brittany, everything dated and saved. I drove home from Patricia's office with a folder of notes and a feeling I could only describe as the return of my own feet beneath me. It was 2 days later that I received the evidence I had not been looking for, but could not ignore. My neighbor, Carol Whitfield, called me on a Wednesday afternoon. Carol was not a gossip. She was a retired school teacher who chose her words carefully, and so when she hesitated before speaking, I knew what she said next would matter. "Dorothy, I don't know if this is my business, but I saw Kevin and Brittany last night at the Riverside Grill. They were with another couple, and I wasn't trying to overhear, but it was a small space. I heard Brittany telling the other woman that once they got the house settled in their names, they were going to push for Kevin to reduce contact with you entirely. She called you—" Carol stopped. "What did she call me?" I said. Carol's voice was careful. She called you a financial resource they were done needing. The kitchen was very still. She said that once Brittany's father co-signed instead, they'd have more flexibility. Her father had apparently already agreed in principle. They were just waiting for the right time to transition. I thanked Carol. I hung up. I sat in the stillness of my kitchen. A financial resource they were done needing, not a mother. Not a person who had given 14 months of payments and her name and her credit and her Sunday dinners and her mother's cornbread recipe. A resource. Temporary. To be replaced by a more convenient one once the infrastructure was in place. The plan was no longer about consequences or clarity. The plan was about survival. I called Patricia Greer's office and left a message. Then I sat down with my legal pad and rewrote the plan from the beginning, this time without sentiment. I stopped the payment on the 1st of November. It was a simple thing, mechanically. I logged into my bank account, found the scheduled transfer, and canceled it. $1,100 that would remain in my account instead of flowing silently into the house on Clarksville Road. I sat looking at the screen after I did it. There was no dramatic feeling, just a quiet solidifying, like concrete setting. I had already sent a certified letter to the mortgage servicer, written with Patricia's guidance, stating that I was a co-signer on the loan and was formally requesting information about the co-signer release process. The letter was factual and dry and gave nothing away. It simply established that I was aware of my rights and beginning to exercise them. Patricia had advised me to keep communication with Kevin and Brittany minimal until I had clearer legal footing. I agreed. I said nothing to Kevin when he texted on Tuesday to say he was thinking of me. I said nothing when Brittany sent a stiff, 3-line message on Thursday saying she hoped we could move forward productively. I read both messages, saved screenshots of them, and returned to my living room. The mortgage servicer's response arrived by mail on November 8th. It confirmed that a co-signer release was possible, but would require the primary borrowers to reapply and qualify independently. The letter also noted that any missed payments during the process would affect all parties on the loan. That was the piece I had been waiting to understand. It arrived on a Friday. On Saturday morning, Kevin called. His voice was different from the Sunday he'd appeared on my porch. That day, he had been ashamed. This day, he was tight, controlled, with something hard underneath. "Mom, the payment didn't come through." "No," I said. "It didn't." A pause. "Was that a mistake?" "No," I said again. Another pause. Longer. I heard Brittany's voice in the background, low and insistent, and then Kevin said, "Can we come over and talk about this?" I said yes. I thought it was important that they come to me, to Maple Creek Drive, to my kitchen, not theirs. They arrived at 11. Brittany walked in first, which told me everything about how the conversation had been choreographed. She sat in the chair across from me and did not take off her coat. Kevin sat beside her, slightly behind, the same posture as the last time. "Dorothy?" Brittany's voice was the same smooth instrument it always was, but there were strings pulled tight beneath it now. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Kevin and I want to resolve this." "There's no misunderstanding," I said. She blinked. "You missed the payment." "I canceled it. It won't be coming." The smoothness cracked, just slightly, at the edges. "Dorothy, we have a mortgage. We have a baby coming. This is not the time for whatever point you're trying to make." "I'm not making a point," I said. "I'm making a decision. You told me to respect your boundaries. I'm respecting them. My financial involvement in your household is, I think, a boundary issue." Kevin leaned forward. "Mom, come on. That's not what she meant." "Kevin," I said quietly, "what did she mean?" He didn't answer. Brittany's tone shifted then. The warmth drained away entirely, and what was underneath was much less pleasant. Let me be direct, Dorothy. You're a co-signer on that loan. If you stop paying and we miss a payment, it affects your credit too. You'd be damaging yourself. There it was. The threat, dressed up as concern. I'm aware, I said. I've spoken to an attorney. Something moved across Brittany's face. Surprise, quickly covered. What attorney? Patricia Greer. She's been very helpful. Brittany stopped, recalibrated. Dorothy, this is family. You don't bring attorneys into family matters. You brought ultimatums into family matters, I said. I'm just matching the register. Kevin stood up. He wasn't angry, exactly. Kevin rarely did anger cleanly, but he was agitated, color rising in his face. Mom, if you do this, it's going to cost us. It's going to be a serious problem. Is that what you want? To cause us problems? I looked at my son, my one child, the person I had built my life around for 30 years. What I wanted, I said, was to be treated like your mother. What I got was financial resource. I'm adjusting accordingly. The silence that followed was very complete. Brittany stood. Her jaw was tight. We'll figure it out without you, she said. And when we do, don't expect to be welcomed back. I'll manage, I said. They left. I heard the front door close. I heard Kevin's car start in the driveway. I stood at the kitchen window and watched them pull away. Then I sat down, put my face in my hands, and allowed myself 10 minutes to shake. 10 minutes exactly. I timed it. After that, I called my travel agent and booked 4 nights at a small inn in Vermont that I had always meant to visit. The foliage would be past its peak by November, but that was all right. I needed cold air and silence and a bed in a room where no one knew my last name. I left on Monday and came back on Thursday, carrying a small jar of maple syrup and the steadiest feeling I had known in months. The drive back from Vermont was quiet in the way I had needed it to be. 4 days of walking through cold air and eating soup in a small dining room and sleeping without a phone on the nightstand. I had thought about Kevin, of course. A mother does not stop thinking about her child because she leaves the state. But I had thought about him the way you eventually learn to think about pain, acknowledging it without letting it run you. I pulled into my driveway on Maple Creek Drive on Thursday afternoon. The maple tree in the front yard had lost most of its leaves. The house looked exactly as I had left it, ordinary and solid and mine. Kevin called that evening. I let it ring. He called again Friday morning. I let that ring too. On Saturday, he called without Brittany. I knew because his voice had a different texture. Quieter, the defensive layer stripped away. He sounded more like himself, or like the self I remembered. Mom, I really need to talk to you, he said. Just us. I considered it. Okay, I said. Sunday, here, 2 o'clock. He arrived precisely at 2, which told me Brittany had coached the punctuality. He came alone, as promised. He was carrying a small box of my favorite coffee from the specialty shop I liked, which was either a genuine gesture or a calculated one. I accepted it without comment and put a pot on. We sat at the kitchen table. He looked tired. His eyes were set in a way that made him look older than 31, and I noticed, the way mothers notice everything, that he'd lost weight since I'd last seen him properly. Mom, he said, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup, I know things have gotten tense. I know Brittany and I know Saturday didn't go well. I'm asking you to please think about what you're doing. Not for her. For me. What do you need me to think about? I asked. We need that payment, Mom. We're stretched. And the baby, he pressed his lips together. We're scared. We're having a baby and we're scared. And I need my mother to be part of that. It was the first time he had said he needed me in a very long time. Was it sincere? Was it Brittany's script? Was it both? I found that I could no longer be entirely certain, and that uncertainty was its own kind of grief. What I had once been able to read in my son's face had become partially obscured by someone else's influence, and I did not know how many layers deep that went. Kevin, I said, I love you. That has not changed. But I heard what Brittany said to Carol Whitfield at the Riverside Grill. He went very still. She called me a financial resource they were done needing. She mentioned that her father would replace me as co-signer when the time was right. I looked at him steadily. Were you aware of that plan? The answer was in his face before he spoke. A brief, involuntary flicker of something that was not quite surprise. He knew. Maybe not the exact words, but he knew the shape of the plan. Kevin, I said quietly, I cannot give money to a household that is planning to dispose of me. He left an hour later without the resolution he'd come for. I watched him go from the kitchen window the way I had watched him go his whole life. After school buses, after first dates, after the morning he'd driven to college. The watching never stopped being hard, but I did not call him back. The following Tuesday, I had lunch with my friend Marjorie Pendleton. We had been friends for 22 years, since our boys were in the same third-grade class, and we'd ended up beside each other at a school bake sale, both of us having made the same lemon bars without planning it. She had been through her own version of family difficulty, a divorce, a daughter who had taken years to come back, and she had the kind of wisdom that comes from having survived things rather than simply read about them. We sat in the back corner of the diner on Elm Street, and I told her everything. She did not interrupt. She did not offer comfort prematurely. When I finished, she sat back and wrapped her hands around her tea. Do you know what the kindest thing you can do for Kevin right now is? She said. What? Stop making it easy for him to choose her over you without consequences. She said it without cruelty. She said it the way a clear window lets in light. I also called Patricia Greer that week. I wanted to know the timeline for a potential co-signer release. Patricia confirmed that the process would take time. The lenders would need to assess Kevin and Brittany's ability to qualify independently, which, given Brittany's reduced income and the incoming baby expenses, was not a given. In the meantime, Patricia advised me to continue documenting everything and to avoid any financial transfers. You've done the hard part, Patricia told me. Now you wait and you don't flinch. I thanked her. I drove home. I made the lemon bars Marjorie and I had bonded over at that bake sale 22 years ago, ate 2 of them, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. For the first time in a long time, I slept through until morning. They came on a Thursday evening, 10 days after Kevin's solo visit. I was in the living room reading when I heard the knock. 2 knocks, firm, not tentative. I already knew before I reached the door that Brittany was on the other side of it. They stood together on the porch. Brittany was holding a casserole dish covered in foil, which was either the most transparent prop I had ever seen or a genuine effort. Kevin stood slightly behind her, which had become his permanent geographic position in relation to his wife. Dorothy. Brittany smiled, and there was the warmth, the tilted head, the full performance assembled. We thought we'd bring dinner. We wanted to do this properly. I stepped back and let them in. I did not know what else to do with a casserole. There are things you cannot close the door on. We ate in the dining room, which I had not used since Christmas. Brittany had made a chicken and rice bake, which was competently done. She talked about the baby's nursery. They were thinking of a nature theme, woodland animals, and asked my opinion, which was new. Kevin talked about a project at work. The conversation was so normal, it was almost convincing. Almost. After dinner, while I was putting the plates in the kitchen, Brittany appeared in the doorway, without Kevin. Dorothy, she said. Her voice had dropped the dinner party register. Can I say something honest? You can try, I said. She came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. I think we got off on the wrong foot. The conversation I had with you, the one about choices, I said it badly. I was stressed, and I said it badly, and I'm sorry. I turned off the water and dried my hands. Okay, I said, but I need you to understand what's at stake right now. She met my eyes. The apology was already behind her. If you withdraw from the mortgage and we have to refinance without you, we'd be looking at a significantly higher interest rate. That affects us for 30 years. We have a baby coming. I'm asking you, mother to mother. She paused meaningfully on the phrase. To think about what you'd be doing to an innocent child. There it was. Under the casserole and the woodland nursery and the apology, there it was. Brittany, I said, you told a woman in a restaurant that I was a financial resource you were done needing. You discussed replacing me as co-signer with your father. Not a flicker of guilt, only a brief recalibration. Carol Whitfield has misunderstood things before, Brittany said smoothly. She's a gossip. She's a retired schoolteacher who called me out of genuine concern, I said, and she has no reason to invent it. Dorothy, what I may have said in a private conversation is exactly the kind of thing that tells me what you say in private is more honest than what you say in my dining room. Her jaw tightened. Kevin had appeared in the kitchen doorway by now, sensing the shift. But he stayed there, on the threshold, the way he always was. Between us, belonging fully to neither space. Brittany's tone shifted entirely, the warmth gone. Let me be honest then, she said. If you push for the co-signer release and we're forced to sell the house, Kevin's credit takes a hit. He'll resent you for it. I'm telling you that directly because I think you deserve to know what you'd be causing. You're telling me, I said, that my son will be turned against me if I protect my own financial interests. I'm telling you the reality. Brittany, my voice was very quiet. That is a threat. I'd like you to know that I recognize it as a threat. She stared at me. I think she had expected tears, or retreat, or the slow, guilty folding that had characterized my responses for the past 2 years. Instead, she got a 63-year-old woman with a legal pad, an attorney, and 14 months of documented payments, standing at her own kitchen sink. Kevin, I said, looking past Brittany, I love you. I hope you know that. But I'm not going to be held financially responsible for a household that is actively planning to exclude me. That is not something any reasonable person would agree to. Kevin looked at his wife. He looked at me. He made the same choice he always made. Mom, I think Brittany is just trying to... I know what Brittany is trying to do, I said. Good night. They left, this time without a hug at the door. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after I heard the car pull away. My hands were not entirely steady. I will admit that. Brittany's threat, Kevin will resent you, had landed because it was aimed precisely at the thing I feared most. But I had learned something standing at that sink. Fear and resolve are not opposites. Fear, I was discovering, could be fuel. I went to the living room, sat in my good chair, picked up my book and read until my hands were steady again. Patricia had suggested the meeting 2 weeks earlier, after I relayed the dining room visit. It might be time, she said, to put everything in the same room. She explained what she had in mind. Not a courtroom, not an adversarial proceeding, but a formal sit-down with a family mediator present. Patricia would attend in her capacity as my advisor. The purpose would be to clearly establish the terms under which I would either continue my involvement or formally pursue co-signer release. The value of a structured meeting, Patricia said, is that it creates a record, and people who are accustomed to informal manipulation tend to become very uncomfortable with records. She scheduled it for a Tuesday morning, 11 o'clock, at a mediation office in town. She sent Kevin and Brittany a formal letter of invitation, co-signed by the mediator. The letter was courteous and precise. It described the meeting as an opportunity to reach a mutually agreeable resolution regarding the mortgage cosigner arrangement. Kevin texted me the night before, "Mom, is this really necessary? Can't we just talk?" I replied, "Tuesday at 11. Please be there." I did not sleep easily that Monday night. I lay in my bed on Maple Creek Drive and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the ways a room full of people and documentation could go wrong. I thought about Kevin's face, the way it looked when he was caught between two forces he didn't know how to reconcile. I thought about Brittany, who was smart and quick and had never once in 2 years been put in a room where the rules were not hers to write. I got up at 5. I made coffee. I went through my folder one more time, checking every page, every date, every figure. Not because I doubted them, because thoroughness was the only form of courage I had available to me at 5 in the morning. They were there. Brittany was dressed carefully. A dark blazer, her hair pulled back, her green eyes sharp and prepared. She had brought her own folder of papers, which told me she'd consulted someone, possibly her father, possibly a friend who knew enough about real estate to feel authoritative. Kevin wore his work clothes, which meant he'd taken time off. He looked at me across the table with an expression I couldn't fully read. The mediator, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Cross, opened the meeting by explaining the process. Everyone would speak. Everything would be documented. The goal was resolution, not blame. Brittany looked at the word documented, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Patricia laid out the core facts without theater. I had co-signed the mortgage 14 months ago. I had voluntarily contributed $1,100 monthly. The relationship had significantly deteriorated. I had sought legal counsel regarding my options. I was now formally requesting either a structured acknowledgement of my contributions and ongoing role, or the initiation of a co-signer release process. Brittany's response came quickly. "Dorothy has always been welcome in our home. We've had some communication difficulties. That's normal in any family. We'd love for her to be involved. We're expecting a baby." Gerald Cross nodded and made a note. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, turning to me, "would you like to respond to that characterization?" "I would," I said. I opened my own folder. The first page was a printed account from Carol Whitfield, signed and dated, describing what she had overheard at the Riverside Grill. The second page was a timeline of my financial contributions, every transfer documented with bank records. The third was the transcript I had reconstructed of the October conversation, the ultimatum, which I had written down the same night and had Patricia review for accuracy. There was also a fourth page, a record of the November dinner visit, the casserole, and the precise words Brittany had used in my kitchen. "Kevin will resent you," dated and written in my own hand the same evening it occurred. I slid copies across the table to Gerald Cross. I slid copies to Brittany and Kevin. Brittany looked at the Carol Whitfield statement. I watched the performance of warmth undergo stress fractures. "This is hearsay," she said. "Carol Whitfield heard a private conversation out of context and—" "Would you like to describe the context?" Patricia said mildly. Brittany stopped. Gerald Cross looked at her. "Ms. Hargrove, the statement describes you saying that Dorothy was a financial resource you were done needing, and that you intended to transition to your father as co-signer. Is that characterization inaccurate? It's taken completely out of—" "Is it inaccurate?" Patricia repeated. The green eyes moved to Kevin. It was a fast, reflexive movement, the kind you make when you need an anchor. Kevin was looking at the third page, the reconstruction of the October ultimatum, and he was very still. "Kevin," Brittany said, a note of urgency now, below the smooth surface. He didn't look up. She tried a different angle. She turned to Gerald Cross with the composed expression of someone accustomed to winning rooms. I think what's being lost here is the emotional context. Dorothy and I have had a difficult dynamic. That's painful for everyone. But turning it into a legal proceeding that damages the possibility of any real reconciliation. Ms. Hargrove, Gerald said, the purpose of documentation is not to prevent reconciliation. It's to ensure that any resolution is built on accurate, shared information. Brittany's composure thinned just slightly at the edges. Kevin, Brittany said again, a note of urgency now below the smooth surface. Brittany, he said. His voice was quiet and strange, the way voices are when they are working something out while speaking. Did you talk to your dad about replacing Mom on the mortgage? The room went still. I mentioned it as a hypothetical, Brittany said. When? Kevin's voice was still quiet. When was it a hypothetical? Kevin, this isn't the place to... I'm asking you a question, he said. And he looked up from the page and looked at his wife. And in his face, I saw something I had not seen in a very long time. Clarity. Brittany reached for the performance one more time. Dorothy, I think what we all want is a positive relationship. What you're doing right now, these papers, this mediator, this is not the way to get that. It's adversarial. It's going to damage things. Brittany, I said, things were already damaged. I'm just making sure there's a record of how they got that way. She had no prepared response for that. Gerald Cross looked around the table. I think, he said carefully, we may need to give everyone a moment. But Kevin was still looking at his mother. And for the first time in longer than I could accurately calculate, my son was looking at me with something that was not distance, not guilt, not managed affection. He was looking at me the way he used to, the way a child looks at the person who has always told him the truth, recognizing it at last, because it had been withheld long enough. The days after the mediation meeting were not dramatic. Real resolutions, in my experience, rarely are. They are paperwork and waiting rooms and phone calls made during ordinary afternoons. But they were decisive. Gerald Cross issued a formal summary of the mediation session within 5 business days, documenting all parties' positions and the specific financial matters in dispute. It was not a legal ruling, but it was a thorough professional record, the kind that matters when things proceed further. Patricia filed the formal request for cosigner release with the mortgage servicer. Given the documentation we had assembled, the timeline of financial contributions, and the written record of the deteriorated relationship, the servicer acknowledged the request and opened a review. For release to proceed, Kevin and Brittany would need to demonstrate they could qualify for the loan independently. They could not. This was the part Brittany had not calculated carefully enough. Her income, since reducing her hours at the marketing firm, had dropped significantly. The new baby meant additional expenses that would factor into any lender's assessment of their debt-to-income ratio. Kevin's salary was good, but not sufficient alone to absorb the full mortgage at the existing terms. To refinance without a cosigner, they would need a substantially improved financial profile, which they did not currently have. I remember the afternoon Patricia called to tell me the lender's preliminary assessment. I was standing in the backyard, pulling dead growth from the flower beds along the fence line, the work I had let go in the fall. I had my gardening gloves on and soil on my knees, and Patricia's voice was matter-of-fact and clear. They don't qualify, she said. Not even close, given Brittany's current income and the baby's projected expenses. I pulled a dead stem from the soil. And her father. That's the other thing, Patricia said. And there was the other piece. Brittany's father, the man who had allegedly agreed, in principle, to replace me, turned out to be less able than promised. He had his own mortgage, his own financial obligations, and when an actual lender ran his numbers, he did not qualify as a cosigner either. The plan Brittany had spoken of so confidently in a restaurant, The plan that had meant I was a temporary resource to be managed and then discarded had not been tested against reality. It had existed only as a story Brittany told to make herself feel more in control. A story she had perhaps even half believed herself, which was its own kind of cautionary detail. Reality, it turned out, had different ideas. I learned this through Patricia, who had maintained a civil professional line of communication with Kevin's own attorney, a young man Kevin had quietly hired in the weeks following the mediation. Kevin hiring his own attorney, separate from Brittany's instincts, was the first sign that the ground between them was shifting. It shifted further in November. Kevin called me on a Sunday, a real call, not a strategic one, and said without preamble, "Mom, I owe you an apology, not for one specific thing, for the accumulation of things, for the chair, for the silence, for the Sunday he'd arrived on my porch and said he was sorry Brittany had said it harshly, as if the harshness were the problem rather than the content." He sat on the other end of the phone and apologized for 2 years of looking at the floor. He said he had known, somewhere beneath the surface of daily life, that things were not right. He said he had told himself it was just adjustment, just the difficulty of merging two families, just Brittany's personality. Sharp, but well-intentioned. He said he had told himself these things because it was easier than looking directly at what was actually happening. "I was a coward, Mom," he said. It was the plainest thing he had said to me in years. I did not make it easy for him, exactly. But I did not make it hard either. I let him speak. I did not perform forgiveness I didn't fully feel yet, because that would have been its own kind of dishonesty. I told him I heard him. I told him I loved him. I told him that love and trust were related but not identical, and that trust was going to need time. He said he understood. He sounded like he meant it. What happened between Kevin and Brittany in the months that followed was not something I orchestrated. Kevin had seen the Carol Whitfield statement. He had heard his wife say the things she'd said, a hypothetical, she'd called it, about her father as co-signer. He had read my reconstruction of the October ultimatum and recognized it as accurate. A man who is presented with a clear picture of the same facts he has been looking at sideways for years does not change immediately. But he changes. By January, Kevin had moved into the spare room of a colleague's house. By February, he had consulted a divorce attorney. He did not ask me how to feel about Brittany. He had stopped needing me to confirm what was in front of him. As for the house, with the co-signer release denied, the lender determined that Kevin and Brittany could not qualify independently, and Brittany's father could not fill the gap. They had a difficult choice. They could find a way to afford the current terms, or they could sell. They sold the house in January. Of the sale, Patricia ensured that my $15,400 in documented contributions was formally recognized. We did not recover every dollar. That would have required a separate civil proceeding that neither Patricia nor I wanted to undertake. But we recovered a meaningful portion, and more importantly, my name came off the mortgage. I was free of it, legally, completely, without remainder. I stood in my kitchen on Maple Creek Drive and held the release documentation. One sheet of paper, unremarkable in appearance, representing a great deal of work and a great deal of pain. I had expected, I think, some large feeling, triumph, or grief, or relief so physical it would bring me to my knees. What I felt instead was quieter than any of that. The particular stillness of something that has been resolved. I put the document in a folder. I placed the folder in the drawer where I kept important papers. I made myself a cup of tea. I drank it at the kitchen table in the quiet of a house that was, and had always been, entirely mine. Then I washed the cup, dried it, put it back in the cabinet, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. Spring came to Maple Creek Drive, and I planted tomatoes for the first time in 4 years. I don't know why I had stopped planting them. Somewhere in the years of adjusting and accommodating and managing Brittany's discomfort with my existence, I had let small things like that go. The kind of small things that, added together, constitute a life. The tomatoes were a beginning. I also joined the Thursday afternoon book club at the Clarksville Public Library. I had driven past the sign for it for 2 years without stopping. 7 women, 3 of whom I already knew by sight, one of whom, a retired nurse named Grace, became, in the slow way that adult friendships form, a genuine friend. We argued about books and ate too many cookies and talked about our children without apology or performance. I was happy, not in a simple or uncomplicated way, but in the specific, textured way that happiness arrives when it has been earned through difficulty. Kevin and I saw each other twice a month, then 3 times. We met at a restaurant first. Neutral ground, the way you proceed carefully after something has broken. Then at my house. Then, in late spring, I went to see the apartment he'd rented in the east part of town, a clean 1-bedroom above a dry cleaner's, modest and organized in the way Kevin had always been when left to his own instincts. He was cooking again. He had started running. He slept better, he told me, than he had in 2 years. He said it without drama. He said it the way you say things when you are still a little surprised by them. We did not talk about Brittany constantly. When we did talk about her, we were careful and precise, not given to speeches. Kevin was working through his own reckoning with what had happened and how much of it he had allowed, and that was his work to do, not mine. What I gave him was consistency. Sunday calls. His grandmother's cornbread recipe, written down this time in my own handwriting, in a card I left on his kitchen counter. The baby was born in March, a girl. Kevin named her Ruth, after his grandmother, which told me more about where his head had been in the previous months than anything he could have said directly. He brought her to my house on a Saturday in April. She was small and serious-faced, and she fell asleep against my shoulder while Kevin sat across from me at the kitchen table and watched. He looked tired in the way new parents are tired, but also present in a way he hadn't been in years. "Hi, Ruth," I said, very quietly, to the small weight against my shoulder. "I'm your grandmother." I did not cry, which surprised me. I felt too full for crying. It would have been a kind of relief, and what I felt did not need relief. It just needed to be. As for Brittany, I did not follow her life closely, because that was not who I wanted to be. But some things reached me through Kevin, or through Carol, or simply through the circuits of a small town. She stayed in Clarksville initially, in an apartment she rented after the house sold. The marketing position she returned to full-time paid less than she'd expected. She'd been out of full-time work long enough that re-entering at her previous level proved more complicated than anticipated. Her father, who had factored so centrally in her plans, had his own financial strains. The relationship was more complicated than she had presented. She had lawyers for the divorce proceedings, but legal fees are not free. The settlement was not generous to either party because there was not much to be generous with. None of this was what I had planned for her. It was simply what happened when the architecture of a life built on managing other people's resources, rather than building your own, encountered the ordinary weight of reality. The last I heard, through Kevin, she had relocated to her parents' city to be closer to them. Kevin navigated the co-parenting with the kind of quiet, determined care he brought to things he decided to do properly. They were not friendly, but they were civil. Ruth would have both parents. That was what mattered, and Maple Creek Drive continued. The tomatoes came in red and plentiful in August. I made sauce, enough to give jars away, to Marjorie, to Grace, to Kevin, who set the jar on his kitchen counter where I could see it the next time I visited. Small things. The kind of small things that, added together, constitute a life. I was 64 years old, and I had remembered who I was. I learned three things from all of this. Love is not a blank check. Kindness without limits is not virtue. It is an open door for people who are looking for one. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to protect them from the consequences of their own choices. If I had kept paying, I would have lost myself to keep the peace. I would have funded my own erasure and called it family. Instead, I stopped. And in the stopping, I found both my son and myself again. I am not a perfect woman, but I am a woman who finally remembered that dignity is not negotiable, not for anyone, and not at any price. What would you have done in my place? If this story spoke to you, leave a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you, truly, for listening.